One of the most fascinating revelations from a Pokemon Terra leak was the discovery of the 2008 builds of Pokemon Black and White. These builds were created over 2 years before the games officially launched, giving us a glimpse into the very early stages of Generation 5's development. These builds were also developed during the production of HeartGold and soulsilver, so they include sprites and even beta versions of towns from Generation 4's Johto. From the Terra leak we learned that Game Freak typically begin rough conceptual planning for the next generation of Pokemon games while still working on the current one. This suggests that pre-production for Pokemon Black and White may have started as early as 2005 or 2006. By the time the studio had finished Pokemon Platinum and moved on to HeartGold and soulsilver, it seems reasonable to assume that full production on Black and White began around 2008. So the earliest playable build of Pokemon Black and White dates back to August 2008. This suggests that by this time, development on HeartGold and soulsilver had progressed enough for Game Freak to shift part of their focus and split the project into the Generation 5 build. And at this stage, you wouldn't expect much from such an early build. Perhaps you'd expect something that feels like a slightly altered Pokemon Platinum. However, the August build offers an intriguing glimpse into how Game Freak initially envisioned Generation 5. Rather than sticking to the familiar framework of previous games, it focuses heavily on world building and experimenting with how gameplay could evolve. It's clear from the environment design that they were already conceptualizing the next generation's unique identity. By this point, Game Freak definitely knew that the next game would be set in a New York inspired region. However, the specifics of gameplay and technical implementation were still being explored. The August build reflects this early experimental phase, showcasing some remarkably ambitious ideas. The layout is drastically different from anything in the first 4 generations, featuring a massive open sandbox area with a freely rotating 3D camera and varied expansive landscapes. This was a radical departure from the typical more grid-based constrained map. In many ways, this early build feels like a prototype for concepts that wouldn't fully realize until much later generations. This particular sandbox-like design and dynamic camera remind me of Dragon Quest VII, giving me an open world feel that almost no other Nintendo DS game has been able to accomplish. In my opinion, this build also hints at an alternate timeline, where Game Freak could have pioneered the HD 2D art style, years before Square Enix popularized it, and shows just how close Game Freak were to pushing those boundaries, only to refine their vision into what Black and White eventually became and the generations that followed. In November 2007, Square Enix released Dragon Quest IV for the Nintendo DS, a remake of a classic NES game. It showcased an early version of what we now recognize as the HD 2D style, blending 2D character sprites with a rotating 3D environment. While this approach initially drew criticism for feeling jarring and lacking some of the features of the original NES game, it ultimately earned praise for its unique visuals. To the best of my knowledge, this was Square Enix's first step into the HD 2D style, a genre they would later refine, popularize, and even trademark. Don't worry, they trademarked the name and not the artistic approach itself. The August build of Pokemon Black and White feels like Game Freak's own experiment with a similar concept, but scaled up dramatically. It wasn't just a 2D game with a 3D camera, it felt closer to a fully realized 3D world, reminiscent of an MMO or an ambitious RPG adventure. And it's incredible that they managed to get something like this working on the Nintendo DS with minimal lag. Then again, it brings to mind games like GTA Chinatown Wars, which had an impressive adaptation of GTA 4's Liberty City that you sped across in cars for most of the time. But just imagine if Generation 5 took the bold step into the open world design. While there's no guarantee it would have been a hit, there is definitely untapped potential in this concept. If Game Freak had pursued this direction, I'd argue they might have been the ones to lead the charge in the HD 2D space, and not Square Enix. But the early Black and White concept gets even crazier. When we jump ahead to the November 2008 builds, these builds introduced multiple scenarios, each being developed by individual team members, showcasing different ideas in a 3D environment. One scenario focuses on Skyarrow Bridge, where players can walk around freely with a fully movable camera. I already love this sequence in the final game, but I love being able to look around and appreciate the set even more. The second scenario is based on Violet City, where you can also rotate your camera. This feels like the most polished example of the open world HD 2D concept, and in my opinion, it shows that the idea could have worked for the entire game. The controls are surprisingly intuitive and functional, which is impressive given the DS's limited button layout. And it just looks really good. And might I point out that some of the cities in the final version of Pokemon Black and White make you feel like you can rotate your camera. It makes me wonder if Game Freak initially designed the region with this idea in mind, but ultimately scaled it back. Castelia City in particular feels like the closest realization of these early open world concepts. There's also an early battle view scenario featuring scrapped Pokemon designs, static view, but I believe in later builds you were able to rotate your camera within battle as well, and the perspective of a Pokemon would change based on whether you're in front of a Pokemon or not. It's understandable why Game Freak didn't include it in Generation 5. With no trainer models displayed during battles, it could easily get confusing figuring out which Pokemon belong to you. The final scenario in these builds is perhaps the most surprising, the platforming concept. This scenario places you in a crowded version of Celestic Town and introduces a jump mechanic. Yes, jumping in the overworld. You could freely hop around, scale small mountains, and bypass stairs entirely. While jumping over ledges seems like an obvious use case, it's hard to imagine how else this feature would have to fit in a traditional Pokemon game. It's possible Game Freak had grander plans for this mechanic, but they likely didn't find enough meaningful applications to justify its inclusion in the final game. Interestingly, the platformer scenario uses the DS's touchscreen for both jumping and camera control. While I personally prefer the button controls for the camera, the touchscreen implementation works surprisingly well and frees up the rest of the buttons for other gameplay functions. It's a clever use of the DS's capabilities, even if it ultimately didn't make the cut. Honestly, the giant roaming Charizards make me think that maybe they planned wild Pokemon in the overworld as far back as 2008, although I kind of understand why it took so long to make this feature work. On the Nintendo DS, rendering 3D models for every Pokemon in an area would have been a technical nightmare, and even the 3DS likely couldn't have handled such an idea without significant compromises, so it wasn't until Pokemon Let's Go on the Nintendo Switch that the series finally embraced this concept. One consistent detail across these builds is the use of a heartgold and soulsilver protagonist sprite. Initially, the builds feature the Johto protagonist sprites, which were later replaced with Beta Generation 5 designs. Then it swapped to Sinnoh protagonists, and eventually returned to another set of Beta Generation 5 sprites, before settling on the final designs that we see in Black and White. So, how would an open world, 2D style Pokemon game like this even work? Well, firstly, it would need to embrace a semi-open world structure, with interconnected open routes that are maybe a bit more linear than a traditional open world game, but still offer a sense of freedom. 2D Pokemon sprites could roam these routes in real time, creating a dynamic world. This approach would give the game a distinct blend of Pokemon's traditional gameplay and the open world feel of games like Dragon Quest. Controlling your camera would be a bit more limited than these early builds. I think just using L and R to turn your camera around is more than enough control. The jumping mechanic introduced in these early builds add a whole different layer. While it's certainly a unique idea for a Pokemon game, its functionality would depend heavily on the overall design. Jumping works naturally in platformers, where traversal is a central gameplay element, but in an RPG like Pokemon, it would need a clear purpose to avoid feeling like a gimmick. Perhaps if a game leaned into exploration, like scaling mountains, clearing obstacles, or reaching hidden areas, the mechanic could play a meaningful role. This would require a shift towards action-adventure gameplay, blending Pokemon's core mechanics with elements from traditional JRPGs. Regardless, I'm sure Square Enix had a huge inspiration on how Game Freak wanted to evolve their style. I do believe a game like this could have worked, but I also have a good theory on why Game Freak never went this experimental route, and I'm pretty sure you have the same idea. It just comes down to the time frame Game Freak had. Game Freak is a relatively small studio, and they were much smaller in 2008. When you're given a tight 2-year window to develop the next generation of Pokemon, the pressure is on to deliver a game that doesn't disappoint fans and meets the expectations set by previous entries. And I still think that Game Freak managed to make amazing games in Pokemon Black and White. It still pushed boundaries, and we got some great 3-dimensional elements in the games. And it was the closest Game Freak ever were to the quote-unquote HD 2D style. They still managed to give it the intended soft reboot feel, and put a big focus on storytelling, and they didn't need a huge open world to do it. There simply just wasn't enough time or resources to push their initial ideas to their full potential. A lot of people claim that this was the most ambitious Game Freak had ever been. Of course, Pokemon was evolving in the 2D space, constantly pushing the boundaries of what the series could achieve. If Game Freak had stuck with a 2D style from Generation 6 onward, I truly believe that they could have pioneered the genre in a way that no other developer could, perhaps even surpassing the likes of Square Enix in terms of innovation. But because they made the shift to 3D with Generation 6, it's almost like they restarted all of that evolution that they were building in 2D in order to even build a Pokemon Foundation in 3D. While we're beginning to see Pokemon evolve in 3D with recent generations, I still think there's so much untapped potential in the 2D space. So in the future, I would love to see Game Freak revisit the 2D genre and create a proper HD 2D Pokemon game. And I'm not talking about outsourcing it to another studio, because I think Game Freak is a creative company that is limited by tight schedules, and if they had the time to focus on a solid HD 2D game, it could be incredible. Especially if they collaborated with another studio like Square Enix instead of just handing the concept over. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, so feel free to drop a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and maybe even share it with a friend to get their perspective on the matter. If you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss whatever I post next. And thank you for watching.